The yellowed envelope was trembling in my grandfather's hands as he lay dying in this sterile hospital room, his 85-year-old body finally giving up after fighting lung disease for 18 months. With his last breaths, he pressed the letter into my hands and whispered the words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about our family. Sophia, this letter. I wrote it 40 years ago to the woman I truly loved, not your grandmother. I've been living a lie for 4 decades, and you need to know that the man you called Grandpa was a coward who chose duty over love and destroyed 2 lives in the process. The heart monitor was beeping frantically as Nurse Martinez tried to calm him, but Grandpa's eyes were wild with the desperation of a man who knew he had minutes left to confess the most devastating secret of his life. Before I continue my story, I really want to know where you're watching me from. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, and if you can, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. My name is Sophia Mitchell, and I'm 26 years old, sitting in room 207 at Denver Medical Center watching my grandfather Theodore James Mitchell die while holding a love letter that was never sent. 4 hours ago, I thought I knew everything about my family's history. Grandpa Theodore had married my grandmother Dorothy in 1960. They'd had my mother in 1965, and they'd lived what seemed like a devoted marriage together until Grandma died of Alzheimer's 8 years ago. But this letter, written in Grandpa's careful cursive and dated September 22nd, 1983, was addressed to someone named Catalina Morales, a woman whose name had never been spoken in our house. What I was about to discover would reveal that my grandfather's entire marriage was built on a foundation of sacrifice, that my grandmother lived her whole life with a man whose heart belonged to someone else, and that somewhere in this world was a family who had no idea that the man they'd lost had been thinking about them every day for 40 years. The story began in the spring of 1982 when Grandpa was 44 years old and working as an electrical engineer for a mining company in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He'd been married to Grandma Dorothy for 22 years, and while they had built a stable life together, he described their relationship as comfortable but hollow. 2 people who cared for each other but had lost any trace of passion or deep connection years earlier. Then Catalina Morales was hired as the new safety inspector for the mining operation, and Grandpa's carefully ordered world exploded into chaos. Catalina was 36 years old, a brilliant engineer who had fought her way up in a male-dominated industry through sheer determination and exceptional skill. She was also devastatingly beautiful, with long black hair, intelligent dark eyes, and a laugh that could light up the entire mining office. But it wasn't just her appearance that captivated Grandpa. It was her mind, her passion for her work, and the way she challenged him intellectually in ways that no one had in decades. Their first conversation lasted 4 hours. What started as a routine safety briefing turned into an intense discussion about engineering principles, mining regulations, and then somehow into deeper topics about life, dreams, and the compromises people make as they get older. I felt like I was waking up from a 20-year coma, Grandpa whispered to me as the machines around his hospital bed beeped ominously. Talking to Catalina was like remembering who I used to be before I became just a husband and father going through the motions. What Grandpa didn't tell me initially was how quickly their professional relationship became something much more dangerous. Within weeks of Catalina's arrival at the mining site, they were finding excuses to work late together every evening. She would stay behind to review safety protocols while he checked electrical systems, but they both knew the real reason they lingered after the other workers had gone home. Their conversations during those late evening sessions revealed 2 people who were intellectually and emotionally starved in their current relationships. Catalina confided that Miguel, while a good man, had no interest in her engineering work and often made dismissive comments about her career ambitions. Grandpa admitted that he and Dorothy had stopped having meaningful conversations years earlier, communicating only about household logistics and their daughter's activities. Catalina would ask me about my engineering theories, my ideas for improving mining safety, Grandpa remembered, his voice getting stronger as he recalled those early days. She would challenge my assumptions, propose alternative solutions, push me to think in ways I hadn't in years. Dorothy never asked me about my work beyond whether I'd had a good day. For 6 months, their relationship remained technically professional but was charged with an undeniable emotional and physical tension. They would find excuses to work late together, reviewing safety protocols and discussing improvements to the mining operation. But underneath the technical conversations was a growing attraction that both of them were fighting desperately to ignore. The turning point came during the company Christmas party in December 1982. Both Catalina and Grandpa attended with their respective partners, she with Miguel, he with Dorothy. But they spent the entire evening acutely aware of each other across the room, stealing glances and feeling miserable watching their colleague laugh and dance with someone else. Seeing her with Miguel that night was torture, Grandpa confessed. She looked beautiful in a red dress, and Miguel was clearly proud to be with her, but I could see in her eyes that she was as unhappy as I was. We barely spoke that evening, but the tension between us was so obvious that your grandmother asked me on the drive home if I was feeling all right. That was the night Grandpa realized he was in love with Catalina, and the night he started seriously considering what it would mean to act on those feelings. Catalina was unmarried but involved with a man named Miguel Santos, a teacher in Albuquerque who wanted to marry her and start a family. Grandpa was married to my grandmother and had a teenage daughter to consider. Both of them knew that acting on their feelings would destroy multiple lives. But in October 1982, everything changed during a mining accident that nearly killed them both. A section of the mine collapsed during a routine inspection, trapping Grandpa and Catalina underground for 14 hours before rescue teams could reach them. In the darkness, not knowing if they would survive, they finally confessed their love for each other. "We thought we were going to die down there," Grandpa told me, his voice getting weaker with each word, "and we couldn't bear the thought of dying without telling each other the truth. So we did. We told each other that we were desperately, completely in love." When they were finally rescued, bruised, and traumatized but alive, they had to face the reality of what their confession meant. They were both committed to other people, but they had acknowledged a love so powerful that it made their existing relationships feel like pale shadows. The rescue team found them holding hands in the darkness, and in the chaos of the emergency response, no one questioned why a supervisor and safety inspector might be comforting each other after a near-death experience. But Grandpa and Catalina knew that everything had changed in those 14 hours underground. "The first few weeks after the accident were the most confusing of my life," Grandpa told me. "We tried to go back to normal, to pretend that what we'd said in the mine was just trauma talking. But every time we looked at each other, every time we were in the same room, the air felt electric." They began having lunch together, ostensibly to discuss the accident report and new safety procedures. These lunches stretched from 1 hour to 2, then 3, as they found excuses to extend their time together. They would drive to restaurants in neighboring towns where they were less likely to be seen by colleagues, and their conversations grew more personal and intimate with each meeting. During one of these lunches in early November 1982, Catalina broke down crying while describing her relationship with Miguel. "I care about him deeply," she told Grandpa, "but I feel like I'm suffocating. He wants me to quit my job when we get married, to focus on having children and supporting his teaching career. He doesn't understand that my work isn't just a job, it's who I am." Grandpa reached across the table and took her hand, and that simple touch ignited something that neither of them could ignore any longer. "That was the moment we both knew we were going to have an affair," Grandpa admitted. "We didn't say it out loud, but we both felt it." For the next 8 months, they carried on a secret relationship that consumed both of their lives. They would meet at hotels during business trips, steal moments together in empty conference rooms, and have hours-long phone conversations when they were apart. It was the most intense, passionate relationship either of them had ever experienced. But it was also destroying them both psychologically. The constant lying, the guilt, the knowledge that they were betraying people who trusted them. It was taking a toll that became harder to hide as the months went on. "I started losing weight, couldn't sleep," Grandpa remembered. "Your grandmother kept asking if I was feeling well, if something was wrong at work. And Miguel was asking Catalina the same questions. We were both falling apart from the stress of living double lives." The situation became even more complicated when Grandpa's mining company announced that they were opening a new operation in Colorado and looking for experienced supervisors to transfer. The logical choice was Grandpa, but taking the promotion would mean leaving New Mexico and Catalina behind. The company offered me a significant raise and a chance to oversee the entire electrical operation, Grandpa explained. It was the kind of opportunity that comes once in a career, but accepting it would mean ending things with Catalina, and I wasn't ready to do that. Catalina, meanwhile, was facing her own impossible decision. Miguel had proposed marriage and was pressing her for an answer. He'd found a larger apartment, started talking about setting a wedding date, and making plans for their future together. She knew she had to either commit to Miguel or break up with him, but doing either felt like betraying someone she cared about. "I was lying to your grandmother every day," Grandpa confessed, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Coming home and pretending to care about dinner plans and your mother's school activities while my heart was completely somewhere else, and Catalina was doing the same thing with Miguel, who was a good man who loved her and deserved better." The affair reached a crisis point in June 1983 when Catalina discovered she was pregnant. The baby was definitely Grandpa's. She and Miguel hadn't been intimate in months because of the strain their relationship was under due to her emotional distance. Catalina was faced with an impossible choice: tell Miguel the truth and destroy his life, or somehow convince him the baby was his and live with the lie forever. The pregnancy revelation forced both of them to confront the reality of their situation in a way they'd been avoiding for months. They couldn't continue their affair indefinitely, and now there was a child involved who would be affected by whatever decision they made. When Catalina told me she was pregnant, I felt joy and terror in equal measure, Grandpa confessed, his breathing becoming more labored as the story continued. Joy because we had created a life together. Terror because I knew that child would force us to make choices we'd been putting off. They spent weeks discussing their options, meeting in secret to plan a future that seemed impossible but desperately wanted. Catalina had already begun pulling away from Miguel, making excuses to avoid physical intimacy and deflecting his questions about setting a wedding date. She was prepared to break up with him and raise the baby alone if necessary. Meanwhile, Grandpa was wrestling with his own impossible decision. Catalina wanted him to leave Dorothy and start a new life with her and their child. She had already decided to end things with Miguel, claiming she wasn't ready for marriage, and was prepared to raise the baby as a single mother if Grandpa couldn't make the commitment. "She gave me an ultimatum," Grandpa remembered. "Not a cruel one, but a necessary one. She said she couldn't continue living in limbo, lying to Miguel while waiting for me to decide what I wanted. She needed to know if I was going to choose our life together or stay with my family." The deadline she gave him was August 15th, 1983, the day she planned to tell Miguel that their relationship was over. If Grandpa was going to leave Dorothy, he needed to do it by then so they could start their new life together before the baby was born. Those 8 weeks between June and August were the most torturous of Grandpa's life. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Dorothy slept peacefully beside him, trying to imagine what it would be like to tell his wife that he was leaving her for another woman. He thought about my mother, who was 17 and planning to start her senior year of high school. How could he disrupt her life during such a crucial time? "I was a coward," Grandpa whispered, his voice becoming weaker. "I thought about my responsibility to Dorothy, who had done nothing wrong. I thought about your mother, who was only 17 and needed stability. I thought about my reputation, my job, the scandal it would cause in our small community. But mostly, I was just scared. Scared of hurting people, scared of starting over, scared of choosing happiness when it would come at such a cost to others." If this story is shocking you, hit that subscribe button because what Grandpa did next destroyed not just his own life, but the lives of everyone he was trying to protect. In September 1983, Grandpa made the decision that would haunt him for the next 40 years. He told Catalina that he couldn't leave his family, that their relationship had to end, and that he would transfer to a different mining operation to ensure they never saw each other again. The letter I was holding was the one he wrote to her after making that decision. A 12-page confession of his love, his regret, and his reasons for walking away. But he had never sent it, keeping it hidden in his desk drawer for 4 decades as a reminder of the biggest mistake of his life. "I wrote that letter 100 times," Grandpa told me. "I wanted to explain everything to her, to tell her that leaving her was the hardest thing I'd ever done, that I would love her for the rest of my life, that if I could do it over again, I would choose differently. But I never sent it because I was afraid it would make things harder for her. I thought a clean break would be better, that she could move on and find happiness without being reminded of what we'd lost." The decision to keep the letter was emblematic of all the other cowardly choices Grandpa had made throughout the affair. Even in his final gesture of love, he had chosen what he thought was easier over what was honest. What Grandpa didn't know was that Catalina had made her own devastating decision after he left. Unable to face raising his child alone and heartbroken by his abandonment, she had contacted Miguel and convinced him to take her back by claiming the baby was his. The reunion with Miguel had required Catalina to construct an elaborate lie about a brief reconciliation that had resulted in the pregnancy. Miguel, who loved her desperately and had been devastated by their breakup, accepted her explanation without question and immediately proposed marriage again. "I learned all this from the private investigator 20 years later," Grandpa explained, his voice barely audible now. Catalina had told Miguel that she'd been confused and scared after their breakup, that she'd had a brief relationship with someone else but realized it was a mistake. She convinced him that the pregnancy was the result of one night together after a chance encounter. Catalina married Miguel just 3 months after Grandpa left New Mexico, and Miguel never questioned the timeline or asked for details about the baby's biological father. He was so grateful to have Catalina back in his life that he accepted her explanation and threw himself into preparing for fatherhood with enthusiasm and love. But Catalina's sacrifice was even more profound than Grandpa had realized. Not only had she married a man she didn't love to provide stability for their child, but she had also convinced Miguel that the baby was conceived during a moment of passion between them, a moment that had never actually occurred. Miguel spent 40 years believing that Carlos was the product of their love, Grandpa continued, tears streaming down his face. He never knew that the son he raised and adored was actually the biological child of the man Catalina truly loved. She carried that secret for 4 decades, watching Miguel bond with our child while knowing the truth about his parentage. The weight of this revelation was staggering. Not only had Grandpa and Catalina sacrificed their own happiness, but they had also built Carlos's entire identity on a foundation of lies. Miguel had loved and raised a child who wasn't biologically his, while Grandpa had missed 40 years of his son's life, and Carlos had grown up never knowing his real father. "I hired a private investigator 20 years ago," Grandpa confessed, his voice barely audible now. "I needed to know what happened to her. What happened to our child? The investigator found them living in Phoenix. Catalina and Miguel had been married for 37 years. They'd raised our son, Carlos, who became a doctor. Miguel died 3 years ago thinking Carlos was his biological son. Carlos is 40 years old now, Sophia. He's your uncle, and he has no idea that half his DNA comes from our family. He has 2 children of his own, your cousins, who don't know they're related to us." The machines around Grandpa's bed started beeping more urgently, and I could see him struggling to stay conscious long enough to finish his story. "The worst part," he whispered, "is that I found out your grandmother knew." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean she knew?" "She confronted me in 1984, a year after I'd transferred away from the New Mexico job. She'd noticed the changes in me, the way I'd become distant and sad. She demanded to know what was wrong, and I told her everything." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My grandmother, the woman I'd thought had lived a happy, ignorant life with a devoted husband, had actually spent 39 years knowing that the man she was married to was in love with someone else. "What did she say?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "She said she'd suspected for months that there was someone else. She said she could see it in my eyes, in the way I'd started acting. And then she said the most devastating thing I've ever heard. Grandpa paused, struggling to breathe before continuing. She said, "I know you don't love me the way you love her, Ted, but I love you enough for both of us. So we're going to stay married, we're going to raise our daughter, and we're going to pretend this conversation never happened. But don't you ever let me see that sadness in your eyes again." Tears were flowing freely down my face as I realized the true scope of the tragedy. My grandmother had chosen to live with a man who was mourning another woman for nearly 4 decades, and she had done it with full knowledge of what she was sacrificing. "Did you ever contact Catalina again?" I asked. "Once," Grandpa said. "In 2010, after your grandmother died. I thought maybe it wasn't too late for us to find some happiness together. I found her address and drove to Phoenix." She was living alone. Miguel had died 2 years earlier. I sat in my car outside her house for 3 hours, trying to work up the courage to knock on her door. But then I saw her come outside to water her garden, and she looked so peaceful, so content. She'd built a life without me. She'd raised our son, been a good wife to Miguel, become a grandmother to children who called her abuela. I realized that showing up after 27 years would be selfish. It would force her to relive all that pain just so I could feel better about my choices. So I drove away. But I never stopped loving her, Sophia. Not for a single day in 40 years. The heart monitor started making a constant tone, and nurses rushed into the room. But Grandpa gripped my hand with surprising strength and pulled me close for his final words. "That letter, it has Catalina's last known address. And Carlos, our son. He's Dr. Carlos Santos at Phoenix General Hospital. They deserve to know the truth about their family. They deserve to know that someone loved them from a distance for 40 years. Promise me you'll find them. Promise me you'll give Catalina the letter I should have sent 40 years ago." Theodore James Mitchell died at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, leaving behind a granddaughter who had to decide whether to honor a dying man's wish or let sleeping secrets lie undisturbed. The letter, when I finally read it that night in my hotel room, was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing I'd ever seen. 12 pages of a man pouring out his soul, confessing his love, explaining his reasons for leaving, and begging forgiveness for choosing duty over passion. The final paragraph read, "My dearest Catalina, if you ever read this letter, please know that leaving you was not a rejection of our love. It was the most painful sacrifice I've ever made. You and our child will be in my thoughts every day for the rest of my life. I pray that you find happiness, that you find someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved, and that our child grows up knowing he is cherished, even if he never knows by whom. You are the great love of my life, and I will carry you in my heart until my last breath. Forever yours, Theodore." 2 weeks later, I made the decision to honor Grandpa's dying wish. I flew to Phoenix and knocked on Catalina Morales Santos's door. She was 76 years old now, with silver hair and kind eyes that looked exactly like my grandfather had described them. When I introduced myself and explained who I was, she invited me in for coffee, and we talked for 6 hours. "I never stopped thinking about your grandfather," she told me. "Miguel was a wonderful husband and father, and I grew to love him deeply over the years. But Theodore was the love of my life. Losing him broke something in me that never quite healed." When I gave her the letter, she read it silently while tears streamed down her face. "He kept this for 40 years?" she whispered. "He kept it and reread it constantly," I told her. "He said it reminded him of the most important thing he'd ever lost." The next day, I met my Uncle Carlos, a successful cardiologist who was shocked to learn that the man he'd called father for 40 years wasn't his biological parent, but who was also deeply moved to discover that his real father had loved him from a distance his entire life. "I always felt different from my dad," Carlos told me. "We looked nothing alike, had completely different interests, different ways of thinking. I used to wonder if I was adopted. Now it all makes sense." The family reunion that followed was complicated but beautiful. Carlos's children, my cousins, were fascinated to learn about their grandfather Theodore and their American relatives. Catalina shared stories about her brief but intense relationship with Grandpa, while I shared memories of the man who had raised me. But the most healing moment came when Catalina decided to visit Grandpa's grave in Denver. Standing at his headstone, she placed the letter on the ground and said, "Theodore, my love, I got your letter. I forgive you for leaving, and I want you to know that our son turned out to be an amazing man. We did okay without you, but we never forgot you." 6 months after Grandpa's death, Catalina passed away peacefully in her sleep. Carlos found a box in her bedroom containing dozens of photos, letters, and mementos from her relationship with Theodore, including a journal where she had written to him every year on the anniversary of the day they met. The last entry, written just weeks before her death, read, "Theodore, our granddaughter found me and gave me your letter. After 40 years, I finally understand why you left. You were trying to protect everyone you loved, even if it meant sacrificing your own happiness. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just grateful that we had those months together and that our love created something beautiful in Carlos. I'll see you soon, my darling." Today, our blended family stays in close contact. Carlos and his children visit Denver regularly, and I've spent holidays in Phoenix with Catalina's extended family. We've created something beautiful from the wreckage of a 40-year-old secret. But the story has also taught me that love isn't always about grand gestures and romantic ideals. Sometimes love is about sacrifice, about choosing other people's well-being over your own happiness. My grandfather and grandmother both made devastating sacrifices. He gave up the woman he loved, and she accepted a marriage to a man whose heart belonged to someone else. Neither choice was right or wrong. They were just human decisions made by people trying to do the best they could in impossible circumstances. Share this story if it moved you, because sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones that require us to let go of what we want most. And sometimes the most important letters are the ones that take 40 years to reach their destination. Love and sacrifice, healing and forgiveness win, always.